Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today, I have a captivating and emotional story that will grab your attention from the very first minute. It's a tale about true friendship, betrayal, and the tough choices we sometimes have to make in life. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a new video. Alright, let's get started. Part 1. The Hidden Truth. For over 30 years, I've known George. He was one of those guys who always stood by his friends, no matter what. He was a quiet man, someone you could trust. A man who believed in doing what was right even when it wasn't the easy option. He didn't look for praise or attention. He just lived his life the way he thought he should. George had been in a relationship with Sarah for almost 8 years. They had met when they were both in college in the early 90s, and from the moment they became a couple, it seemed as though they were inseparable. Everyone around them, friends, family, even acquaintances, saw them as a perfect match. They were always seen together, laughing, holding hands, posting photos on social media about their adventures. They appeared like the kind of couple you'd see in a romantic movie, with no hint of the cracks that might lie beneath. I had always respected Sarah, and I had never thought twice about their relationship. They had their ups and downs, like any couple, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sarah was beautiful, graceful. People were often captivated by her. George was more reserved, but he had a warmth about him that made you feel comfortable. They seemed happy, and I didn't question it. However, things began to change over the past few months. George and I would occasionally grab a cup of coffee at the local diner, and he began confiding in me about some strange behavior Sarah had been displaying. At first, he thought it was just work stress or maybe something he was doing wrong. But over time, it became clear that something was off. George, being the trusting person he was, would often say things like, "I just can't figure out what's happening. She's not herself lately. She's been distant, cold even. But every time I ask, she says I'm imagining it. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid." I could tell he was confused, and there was a slight unease in his voice when he talked about Sarah. But I never thought it was anything too serious. After all, relationships have their ebbs and flows. It wasn't until I ran into Carol, a mutual acquaintance of both George and Sarah, that things started to unravel. Carol was a longtime friend of Sarah's, someone I had met years ago at a local community event. She and I were never particularly close, but we kept in touch through mutual friends. One evening, while we were having a conversation at a neighborhood gathering, she casually mentioned something that caught me off guard. "You know," Carol said, almost nonchalantly, "Sarah's been seeing someone else. Her ex-husband, actually." I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard her correctly. It wasn't that I didn't believe Carol, but the idea seemed out of place. Sarah had always spoken highly of George, and their relationship seemed solid, at least on the outside. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to mask the unease that had begun to settle in my stomach. "Sarah and her ex-husband? I thought she was over him." Carol nodded, her expression serious. "They've been seeing each other behind George's back for months now. And it's not just some brief affair. It's much deeper than that. She's been meeting him regularly, sneaking around, even sending him pictures and messages. It's been going on for a while now." My heart sank as I tried to process what Carol had just told me. I couldn't imagine Sarah, the woman who had been George's rock, betraying him in such a way. But Carol was insistent, and she mentioned a few more details that confirmed this wasn't just a rumor. After our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to tell George. But how? How do you break that kind of news to someone who trusts you, someone who believes in the love they share with another person? I knew that if I told George the truth, his world would come crashing down, could ruin everything for him. For a few weeks, I wrestled with the decision, unsure of whether I was doing the right thing. Every time I saw George, I could see the love and excitement in his eyes whenever he spoke about Sarah. He had told me a few times recently that he was planning on proposing to her, and I could sense how eager he was to take the next step in their relationship. The thought of destroying that joy, that hope, made my stomach churn. Then, one afternoon, things took a turn. I received a message from Carol again, and this time, it was more urgent. She had sent me screenshots, messages from Sarah's phone, proving everything Carol had mentioned. In those messages, Sarah was talking to her ex, making plans to meet up and even sending him intimate pictures. I felt my hands shake as I read through the texts. There was no denying it now. Sarah had been unfaithful to George, and he had no idea. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. George had a right to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be. But how could I even begin to approach him? How could I tell my friend that the woman he loved was lying to him? I decided that I needed to gather more evidence before confronting him. I couldn't just tell him what I had heard. I needed concrete proof. So, I reached out to Carol once more, asking her if there was anything else she could share. She sent me more photos and text threads, each one confirming what I had dreaded. By the time I had everything I needed, I felt like I was holding a ticking time bomb. George was about to propose to Sarah, and I was the only one who knew what was really going on. I couldn't let him go through with it without at least giving him a chance to make an informed decision. But how would he react? Would he believe me? Would he even want to hear it? The weight of the decision pressed down on me as I made my way to George's house one evening. He had called earlier that day, excited as ever about his plans. He mentioned that he wanted to talk about something important, and I assumed it was his proposal. As I knocked on his door, my heart raced. The truth was heavy, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to break it to him. But I knew it was time. Part 2. The confrontation. As I knocked on George's door, I felt my palms grow clammy. The moment had arrived, and I had no idea how he would react. Would he listen to me, or would he reject everything I had to say? The weight of what I was about to do hung heavily in the air. George answered the door with his usual smile, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Hey, it's been a while. Come on in," he said, stepping aside to let me through. He was in his usual casual clothes, a bit worn from work but looking like the kind of guy who could take on anything. I saw the excitement in his eyes, the same look he had when he told me about his plans to propose to Sarah. It hurt, seeing him so unaware of the storm that was brewing in his life. I smiled back, though I felt a pit in my stomach. "Thanks, George," I said, stepping into the cozy living room. He motioned for me to sit down, offering me a drink, which I politely declined. He was already holding a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking more relaxed than I had expected. "You're looking a bit stressed," he remarked, noticing my stiff posture. "Everything okay?" I swallowed hard. This was it, the moment I had dreaded but knew was coming. "Yeah, just a little. I need to talk to you about something important," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He raised an eyebrow, concern flickering in his eyes. "What's going on? You're making me nervous." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The last thing I wanted to do was hurt him, but the truth was unavoidable. "George, this isn't easy for me to say, but I need you to listen to me carefully. There's something about Sarah, something you need to know." His expression shifted from concern to confusion. "What do you mean? What's going on with Sarah?" I hesitated for a moment, then decided that now wasn't the time for half-truths. I had to be direct. "I've learned some things, George. Sarah's been seeing someone else. Her ex-husband. They've been meeting up behind your back. It's not just a one-time mistake. It's been going on for months." His face went pale and he blinked, as though he hadn't heard me correctly. What do you mean? You're telling me that Sarah's been cheating on me?" His voice was strained, disbelieving. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's true. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but you need to know. She's been seeing him secretly, texting him, sending him pictures. I even have proof if you need it. I just thought you should know before you make any big decisions." George stood up abruptly, the glass of whiskey still in his hand. His knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. "This is a joke, right?" he asked, his voice rising. "This isn't real. Sarah wouldn't do that to me. You're just—" He stopped himself, his breath coming in short bursts. I shook my head. "I wish it was a joke, George. But it's not. I wouldn't tell you this if it weren't true. You deserve to know the truth. I'm not trying to hurt you, but I think you need to face what's happening before it's too late." He took a few steps away from me, pacing back and forth in the small living room. I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to make sense of what I was saying. His eyes were glassy, his face pale. But she's been everything to me. I don't get it. Why would she do this? We've been through so much together. We were supposed to get married. She told me. I interrupted him gently. I know how much you love her, George. And that's why I'm telling you. Because you deserve to know what's really going on. You deserve someone who will love you the way you love them, without secrets. He stopped pacing and turned toward me, his face a mixture of disbelief and hurt. I don't know what to believe right now. I don't even know what to say. He paused, looking at the floor as if searching for answers. This doesn't make sense. We've been together for so long. She's always told me she's happy. She never said anything was wrong. I could see how much this was affecting him, and I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. But I also knew that it was better for him to hear the truth now, rather than be blindsided later when things were even more complicated. You're right, I said softly. She never said anything was wrong because she's been hiding it. People who cheat often do, George. It's not about you. It's about her and the choices she made. He was silent for a long moment, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the whiskey glass down on the coffee table. I can't believe this is happening. I thought she was my future. I thought we were building something together. I know this is hard, I said. But you have to face it, George. She doesn't deserve you. You deserve someone who will respect you, trust you, and love you for who you are. And she's shown you who she really is. The silence in the room felt deafening. George just stood there, lost in his thoughts, staring at the floor. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him. But I knew there was nothing I could say that would make this better. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. I'm going to confront her. Part 3, the confrontation. The next morning, George didn't waste any time. His mind seemed made up, and despite the numbness that lingered in his body, he knew he had to confront Sarah. I could see the resolve in his eyes as he got ready to face the woman he thought he would spend his life with. But there was an air of disbelief about him, as though he couldn't fully wrap his mind around what was happening. I need to do this, he muttered under his breath, pacing in his living room. I need to hear it from her. I nodded, not sure if I should follow him, but not wanting to leave him alone either. Do you want me to come with you? I'm here for you, George. No matter what. He shook his head. No, this is something I need to do on my own. I've always trusted her. And now I need to know if she's going to lie to my face or tell me the truth. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his steps slow but determined. I couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in my stomach as I watched him go. This was it. Everything was about to change for him. Would he find the strength to walk away from the woman he thought he loved? Or would he be blinded by his feelings and continue down a path that would only bring him more pain? As George drove off, I tried to prepare myself for whatever news he might bring back. Part of me hoped Sarah would admit to her mistakes and come clean, but I wasn't optimistic. People who are good at hiding things don't always come clean so easily. I spent the afternoon waiting, my mind racing with scenarios. What would happen when George faced Sarah? Would she try to deny it all? Would she manipulate him into believing that everything was his fault? After all, Sarah was very good at playing the role of the perfect girlfriend. Her charm could make anyone believe whatever she wanted them to. Would it work on George? A few hours later, my phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and my heart skipped a beat. It was George. Hello. I answered, my voice shaky. Marie. His voice came through, raw and emotional. I don't even know where to start. I could hear the tremor in his voice, the unmistakable signs of someone who had just experienced the fallout of their entire world crumbling. I sat down, knowing that what was coming next would be difficult to hear. What happened, George? I asked, my heart sinking. She admitted it, he said quietly. Everything. She didn't even try to deny it. She said it was over, that she was sorry, but it didn't change the fact that it had been happening for months. She told me she had never really been happy, and that she was just going through the motions with me. I could feel his heartbreak through the phone. It was as if the life had been drained out of him, leaving behind someone who was now struggling to hold onto any ounce of dignity. I didn't want to believe it, he continued, his voice shaky. But she said it, Marie. She said it all. That she was seeing him, that she was sending him pictures and messages. She didn't even look guilty, just resigned to it all, like she had already made peace with the fact that I would find out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. And what did you say? I asked her why, he said, his voice cracking. I asked her why she didn't tell me the truth. I asked her if she even cared about me. She said she didn't know anymore. And that's when I realized everything we had, everything I thought was real, was just a lie. I asked her to leave and she did. I didn't want to keep talking to her. Didn't want to hear any more of her excuses. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear the pain in George's voice, and it tore me apart. How could someone who seemed so perfect, so trustworthy, be completely betrayed like this? I'm sorry, George, I whispered. I know this hurts, but you're better off knowing the truth now. You can move forward even if it feels impossible right now. You deserve someone who will love you for who you are. You deserve so much better than this. I don't know where to go from here, he said, his voice barely audible. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I was going to marry her. I thought we'd be happy, together, forever. I know, I replied softly. But this is the beginning of something new, George. It's going to be tough, but you'll heal. It's going to take time, but I'm here for you. You're not alone. We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes, just talking about nothing and everything at once. It wasn't much, but I knew he needed the support. And for now, that was all I could give him. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, thinking about everything that had happened. The truth had come out, but it had come at a high cost. George was hurting, and there was nothing I could do to take that pain away. But he was strong. I knew that much. He would get through this. Later that evening, I received a text from him. I've been thinking a lot, and I'm going to take some time for myself. I need to figure out what I want and what I deserve. I don't want to make any decisions right now. But thank you for being there for me, Marie. You're a true friend. I sighed, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me. He wasn't ready to move on yet, but at least he was taking the first steps toward healing. Part 4, Moving Forward. The days after George's confrontation with Sarah felt like a blur. Every time I checked in on him, I could feel the weight of his words, the shock, the anger, the disbelief, clinging to him like a heavy fog. It wasn't easy. He was hurting in ways I couldn't even begin to describe, and no amount of comforting or advice seemed to ease the ache in his chest. George hadn't spoken to Sarah since the day he confronted her. He had taken a step back from everything, trying to process what had happened. He hadn't reached out to anyone, other than me, for support. I could tell that even though he was surrounded by people who cared about him, he felt utterly alone. We'd been meeting at the local diner for coffee, sometimes in silence, other times talking through what had happened. But every time, the same things kept coming up. How could Sarah, someone who had seemed perfect in every way, betray him like this? Why didn't he see the signs? What had gone wrong? I just can't stop thinking about it, Marie, George admitted one afternoon, pushing his coffee cup aside. I feel so stupid. She'd been pulling away for so long, and I didn't see it. It's like she was slipping through my fingers, and I was too blind to notice. I sighed, watching him closely. You weren't stupid, George. You loved her. That's what makes it so hard to see the truth. When you trust someone so completely, you don't always look for the warning signs. You trust them with everything, and that's what makes betrayal so painful. I don't even know who she is anymore, he said, his voice quiet. It's like I was living in a fantasy, and now the whole thing's shattered. I don't know what's real anymore. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. What's real, George, is that you're here. You're alive and you're strong. You don't need her to define who you are. You're more than your relationship with her. He nodded, though it was clear that the words weren't enough to fill the void that had opened up in his heart. It was going to take time. I knew that much, but it hurt me to see him so lost, so unsure of himself. This wasn't the George the First knew. The George the First knew had confidence, a sense of purpose. But now that seemed like a distant memory. Over the next week, George became more withdrawn. He wasn't answering calls from mutual friends, and he was avoiding most social interactions. Couldn't blame him. How do you face the world after something like this? How do you pick up the pieces when everything you thought you knew about your life has been turned upside down? One evening, I received a message from him. It was a short text, but it was a start. I think I need to get away for a while. Clear my head. My heart sank a little at the thought of him isolating himself even more, but I understood. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to step away from everything and find some peace on your own. I texted him back. Take all the time you need, George. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. He didn't respond right away, but the next morning, I heard from him again. This time, the message was more hopeful. I've booked a trip, just a few days by the lake. I think it'll help me clear my head. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but I think I need some space to figure things out. I smiled at the message. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a sign that George was beginning to make decisions for himself. He was trying to take control of his life again, to rebuild what had been broken. Over the next few days, George disappeared from the city. I didn't hear from him, but I knew he needed that time. The isolation, the silence, could help him find the clarity he needed. Sometimes, when you're drowning in pain, the only thing that can help you float is stepping away from the chaos and finding peace in solitude. On the 5th day, I received a phone call from him. Marie. His voice sounded different, softer, calmer. I think I'm starting to get it. The pain isn't gone, but I'm starting to see that I'm going to be okay. I don't know what my future holds, but I'm going to be all right. It was a small step, but it was a huge one for him. Hearing him speak like this, with a sense of hope in his voice, made me believe that he was on the path to healing. It wasn't going to be quick or easy, but he was finding the strength to move forward. I'm proud of you, George, I said softly. This is just the beginning, but you're getting there. It might take time, but you'll find your way. Thanks, Marie, he said, his voice still filled with emotion. I don't think I would have gotten this far without you. You've been there for me when I needed someone. I can't tell you how much that means to me. You don't need to thank me, I replied. You're my friend, George. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. That conversation marked a turning point. George wasn't healed yet. He had a long road ahead of him, but he had started to see that he could be strong, even without Sarah by his side. He was beginning to rebuild piece by piece. The journey wouldn't be easy, but at least now, he was facing it with clarity and determination. Part 5, The Road to Healing. The following weeks were a mix of good days and bad days for George. He'd returned from his trip with a sense of peace, but the shadows of betrayal still loomed over him. While the solitude had helped him think and reflect, the pain of what Sarah had done didn't disappear overnight. It was still there, lingering, especially when he was alone with his thoughts. At first, he threw himself back into his work. He'd always been dedicated to his job, and it was something he could control. But even that didn't seem to offer the same satisfaction it once did. Every accomplishment, every project he finished, felt hollow without the one person he thought he'd share his life with. He would call me sometimes, his voice sounding less burdened, but still carrying a trace of sorrow. I'm trying, Marie, he would say. I'm trying to move forward, but there are moments where it just hits me again. Like a wave. I'll be fine and then boom. It feels like I'm back to square one. I didn't have any answers for him. I didn't know how long it would take for him to heal, but I told him something that I hoped would make a difference. You're not back at square one, George. You're moving forward. Healing isn't linear. It's messy, and there are days when it'll feel like you're stuck. But I promise you, every step you take counts. Despite his struggles, George made progress. He started to reconnect with old friends he hadn't seen in years. It wasn't easy for him to reach out, but it was something he knew he needed to do. He needed to rebuild the relationships that had been neglected while he was wrapped up in his life with Sarah. One day, I invited him out for lunch. We met at the same diner where we talked for months, but this time, There was something different in the air. George seemed lighter, his eyes more focused. There was a new sense of determination about him. "Marie," he began, setting his coffee cup down with a small smile. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. I've realized something." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "I think I'm ready to start living again. Not for her. Not for anyone else. Just for me." His voice was steady, a quiet confidence I hadn't heard from him in a long time. I smiled, proud of him. "That's a huge step, George. It's not easy to get to that point." "I know, but I've spent so much time trying to figure out what went wrong with her. With us. It's like I was holding onto a broken dream. And I finally get it. I don't need that dream anymore. I need to create my own future." It was the most positive I had heard him in months. It was clear that the man sitting across from me was different from the one who had once been consumed by his relationship with Sarah. This George was reclaiming his life, and that was something worth celebrating. "I'm proud of you," I said, placing my hand on his. "You've come so far, George. You're on the right path." He nodded, his expression softening. "Thanks, Marie. I don't think I could have done it without you. You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't been there." I squeezed his hand. "That's what friends are for. I'm just glad you're starting to see what you deserve. You've always been a great guy, and you deserve someone who will appreciate that." George looked thoughtful for a moment. "I'm not ready to start dating again, but I'm starting to realize that I can be happy on my own, that I can do things for myself now, without having to rely on anyone else to define me." We talked for hours that day, catching up on everything, life, work, our old friends, everything. It wasn't a conversation about pain or betrayal anymore. It was a conversation about growth, about finding strength in adversity. It was the first time I'd seen George genuinely smile in months, and I could tell he was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. By the time we left the diner, George was a different person. There was still work to be done. He still had to fully process his pain and rebuild trust in himself, but he had taken the first big step in finding his own happiness. He was no longer holding onto a broken dream. He was ready to create a new one. In the days that followed, George continued to take small steps toward his healing. He started going to the gym again, something he had always loved doing but had neglected in the wake of his relationship struggles. He reached out to some old friends, reconnecting with people who had once been an important part of his life. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but he was moving forward. One night, about a month after his confrontation with Sarah, George called me. "Marie, I did it," he said, his voice full of excitement. "I signed up for that photography class I've been talking about for years. I've been wanting to learn how to take great pictures, but I always put it off. Not anymore. I'm doing something for me." I couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness for him. "That's amazing, George. I'm so proud of you. That's a huge step. You're taking control of your life. I know I'm nervous, but I feel like it's time. Time to stop letting the past hold me back," he said. "I'm finally doing something for myself." And that was the turning point. Part 6: New Beginnings. Weeks passed, and George's transformation continued. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. The confidence he had lost during his relationship with Sarah was slowly coming back, like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. He was finding joy in the small things again. A good book, a walk in the park, meeting friends for dinner. There was a renewed sense of independence about him, a freedom he hadn't felt in years. His photography class became his sanctuary. He threw himself into it with passion, capturing moments in time through his lens. His teacher, an experienced photographer named Tom, noticed George's dedication and natural talent right away. "You have an eye for this," Tom told him after reviewing his work. "Don't sell yourself short. Keep at it." Hearing those words, coming from someone with real expertise, gave George a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in a long time, he was doing something for himself, something he truly enjoyed. And it felt good. One evening, as we were catching up over the phone, George said something that struck me deeply. "You know, I never thought I'd get to this point. After everything with Sarah, I didn't know if I'd ever be happy again. But now, I'm starting to feel like I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be. I smiled to myself. I've always known you had it in you, George. It just took time for you to see it yourself. He laughed softly. Yeah, I guess so. I've been so focused on what went wrong with her that I forgot to focus on what I want for my own life. I've been missing out on a lot. But not anymore. But even as George embraced these new opportunities and experiences, he was still haunted by the question of trust. Sarah's betrayal had taken a toll on his ability to believe in people again, especially women. He wasn't ready to start dating again, and every time someone tried to set him up with a new person, he would pull back. I'm not ready for that, he would tell me with an uncomfortable laugh. I'm just getting to know myself again. No room for anyone else right now. I understood, though. After a relationship like his with Sarah, it wasn't easy to open up again. And George needed time. Time to heal, to rediscover who he was without being defined by his past pain. It was during this time of self-reflection that he made another important decision. He would take a longer trip. This time, not for solitude or escape, but for discovery. He was going to take a photography tour in the Pacific Northwest. The idea was to immerse himself in nature, to capture the beauty of the world, and see it through a new lens, both literally and figuratively. I've been wanting to do something like this for years, he told me excitedly. This is the right time, Marie. It's time for me to experience something new, something that will really open my eyes to what's out there. I think it's a great idea, George, I said. This could be exactly what you need to take that next step. A week later, George set off for his trip. He sent me pictures and updates along the way, showing me the stunning landscapes he was photographing. In every shot, there was something new in his eyes, a spark of life, of hope, that I hadn't seen before. His messages were filled with excitement and wonder. I've never felt this alive, he wrote after a hike in the Cascades. It's like all the weight from the past is being washed away by the rain, and I can finally breathe. It was clear that this trip was more than just a photography tour for him. It was a journey of self-discovery. Each new place he visited seemed to bring him closer to the person he was meant to be, the person he had lost sight of during the years of his relationship with Sarah. For the first time in a long while, George wasn't just moving on from the past. He was embracing a new future. As weeks passed, George's healing accelerated. He came back from the trip with new perspective. He had new friends, new memories, and a renewed sense of himself. His photographs were more than just pictures. They were his story, his journey. One evening, shortly after he returned, George invited me to dinner. We met at a local restaurant he'd never been to before. Over the course of the meal, we laughed, shared stories, and talked about the future. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been thinking a lot about what you said a while ago, that I'm not defined by my past. It's hard to really believe that, but I'm starting to get it. I smiled at him. I knew you'd come around, George. You're stronger than you think. I guess I've always had it in me, he replied. I just needed to see it for myself. And I'm ready. I'm ready to see where life takes me now. No more holding back. As we finished our meal, George seemed more at peace than I had ever seen him. He was no longer a man broken by betrayal, but someone who had found himself again. And as much as he had healed, I knew he still had a long road ahead of him. There would always be scars from his past. But now he had the strength to face them, to move forward, and to embrace the future. Part 7. The Unexpected Encounter. As the months passed, George's life took on a new rhythm. His photography classes were going well, and his work began to gain recognition, even from other photographers in his circle. He had made new friends, people who appreciated him for who he was and not for the relationship he had once had with Sarah. He was finally allowing himself to be himself again, without apologies, without guilt. Yet, despite everything, there were days when loneliness crept in. It wasn't the deep, all-consuming loneliness he had once felt, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from realizing you don't have anyone special to share your life with, no one to hold close on quiet evenings. He had long moved on from Sarah, but there were moments when the space she once occupied felt too large, too empty. One evening, after finishing a photography project, George sat down in his favorite chair by the window. The city outside was just starting to dim, the warm light of street lamps beginning to glow in the distance. He stared out at the horizon, his mind wandering. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Peter, a mutual friend. "Hey, are you up for a drink tomorrow? I have someone I want you to meet." George raised an eyebrow. Peter had been trying to set him up with a few people ever since his return from the Pacific Northwest. But George wasn't ready. He wasn't sure if he would ever be ready to jump into another relationship, at least not until he fully understood himself and what he wanted. Still, it had been a while since he'd done anything social outside of his photography group. Maybe this was what he needed to push himself a little further. "I don't know, man. I'm not really looking for anything right now," George replied. Peter's response was quick. "I get it. Just thought it might be fun. She's a friend of mine, and I think you'll enjoy talking to her. No pressure. But think about it." George stared at the message for a long time. He had gotten so used to being on his own that the thought of meeting someone new felt like a leap. But deep down, he knew that keeping himself in isolation wasn't the answer. It was time to get back out there, slowly at his own pace. "All right," George typed back. "Let's do it." The next day, George met Peter and his friend, Emily, at a cozy bar downtown. The atmosphere was laid back, with soft music playing in the background. George was immediately struck by how easy it was to talk to Emily. She wasn't like anyone he had met before. She was confident but not overbearing, intelligent but humble. She listened intently as he talked about his photography, asking thoughtful questions, and engaging with his passion. They spent the evening laughing, swapping stories, and talking about their lives. Emily wasn't just interested in George's past. She was curious about his present and what he hoped for the future. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people having a conversation, enjoying each other's company. As the evening wore on, George found himself feeling more relaxed than he had in months. Emily didn't remind him of Sarah, or of the past he had left behind. She was a new chapter, someone who could offer him something different without carrying any baggage. By the time they said their goodbyes, George felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. "Thanks for tonight, George. It was really nice getting to know you," Emily said with a warm smile. "I'm glad we met," George replied, feeling a genuine sense of gratitude. It was a good time. As he walked home that night, his mind was buzzing with thoughts of the evening. He wasn't jumping to conclusions or expecting anything right away, but there was a sense of possibility he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He wasn't looking for a relationship yet, but he realized that meeting someone like Emily, someone who truly saw him for who he was something to hold on to. For the first time since his breakup with Sarah, George felt like he had room in his life for something new, something that wasn't defined by the past. It wasn't about forgetting or erasing what had happened, but about learning from it and moving forward. He had learned to love himself again, and now, maybe, it was time to open himself up to new connections. A week later, George and Emily met for another drink. This time, the conversation flowed even more naturally. They talked about their favorite places to travel, the books they loved, and their shared love for nature. The connection was undeniable, and while neither of them rushed into anything, George felt like he was finally experiencing something fresh and exciting. "This is nice," Emily said as they sat on the patio, watching the sunset. "I'm glad we're taking it slow. No expectations, just enjoying each other's company." George smiled. "Yeah, I'm glad too. Feels different, but in a good way." For once, George wasn't trying to fill the space left by his past relationship. He wasn't comparing Emily to Sarah or wondering if he was making a mistake. He was just present, enjoying the moment and allowing himself to explore what could be. He knew there were no guarantees, but he also knew that he deserved the chance to find happiness, even if it meant taking it one step at a time. Part 8. Trusting Again. As the weeks went on, George and Emily continued to meet up, slowly building a connection that neither of them rushed into. They spent afternoons walking through the park, evenings at coffee shops, and weekends exploring new places around the city. Each time they met, George felt a little more at ease, as though the weight he'd been carrying for so long was beginning to lift. Though he had never really talked about his past with Sarah, Emily seemed to understand him without him needing to say much. She respected his space, and there was no pressure to move things along faster than he was ready for. But there were moments, especially when they were alone, when George felt his heart start to soften. The idea of trusting someone again didn't feel as frightening as it once had. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was room in his life for someone else. One night, Emily invited him over to her apartment for dinner. She had spent the afternoon preparing a homemade meal, something she knew would give them time to talk and enjoy each other's company in a relaxed setting. It wasn't a date per se, but it felt like one. And for George, it was a big step. As they sat down to eat, Emily looked at him with a gentle smile. "I know you've been through a lot, George. I'm not asking you to rush anything. But I also want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready to talk, or whenever you're ready for more, I'll be here." George felt a lump form in his throat. Those words were simple, but they carried so much weight. He had been so used to feeling like he was walking on eggshells, never knowing if he was being judged or if he could trust someone. And yet, here was Emily, offering him the kind of understanding he hadn't realized he needed until now. I don't know what to say," he replied, feeling a mix of vulnerability and gratitude. "I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again. I've been so focused on the past, on what I lost, that I didn't even realize I was shutting myself off from the future, from the possibility of something new." Emily nodded, her eyes kind and patient. "It's okay to take your time, George. You don't have to figure it all out at once. But I think you're already starting to open up, even if you don't realize it." They continued to talk through dinner, and by the end of the evening, George felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. He knew that he wasn't ready to jump into another serious relationship, but there was something about Emily that made him want to try. She wasn't rushing him. She wasn't trying to push him into anything he wasn't ready for. She was simply there, supporting him, being patient. And that made all the difference. The following weekend, George took a break from the usual routine. He hadn't been to his family's cabin in the mountains in over a year, and he realized that he needed some time alone to really reconnect with himself. He called Emily to let her know, and she was understanding as always. "I think this will be good for me," he said over the phone. "Just a weekend away by the lake. A chance to really think about everything." "I hope it helps," Emily replied. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you get back." As George drove out of the city and toward the peaceful solitude of the mountains, he felt a strange sense of calm. The cabin had always been a place of refuge for him, a place to reset and clear his head. And now, as he sat by the lake, watching the sun dip behind the trees, he felt the weight of the past start to shift. He thought about everything. His time with Sarah, the pain of betrayal, the long journey of healing. He thought about Emily and how much she had changed his perspective. It wasn't love yet, not in the way he had once loved Sarah, but it was something real. It was a connection, built on trust, patience, and understanding. It was a foundation that could become something more, if he allowed it. George spent the next 2 days reflecting, reading, and taking long walks by the lake. The solitude gave him clarity. He realized that he wasn't afraid of moving forward anymore. He wasn't afraid of opening his heart to someone else. The fear he had once felt, the fear of being hurt again, had begun to fade. It wasn't gone completely, he was still learning how to trust. But he knew now that he was ready to move forward, at his own pace. When he returned from the cabin, he called Emily. "I think I'm ready to take the next step," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not rushing anything, but I'm ready to let you in, slowly. I want to see where this goes." Emily was quiet for a moment, and then she replied, "George, I'm really happy to hear that. I'm here, and I'm excited to see where this journey takes us. We'll take it slow, just like we've been doing. But I'm glad you're ready." Part 9, the new chapter. George and Emily's relationship continued to blossom in its own time, naturally and without pressure. As George opened his heart to her, he also began opening his heart to the possibilities life had to offer. The man who had once been weighed down by betrayal and heartache was now a man rediscovering his worth, his dreams, and his capacity to love again. Every day he grew a little stronger, a little more at peace with his past, and a little more hopeful for his future. As the months went by, George and Emily spent more time together. They explored new places, supported each other's ambitions, and built a foundation of mutual respect and trust. There were moments, of course, when the past crept up on him, when the memories of Sarah and the pain of his former relationship would surface. But he was no longer running from it. He had made peace with it, and each passing day felt like a small victory in moving forward. One crisp fall evening, George invited me to dinner to catch up. It was the first time I'd seen him in a few weeks, and when he walked into the restaurant, I could see it right away. He was different. There was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, an ease in his smile. Gone was the man who had been broken, the man who feared he would never move on. In front of me now was a man who had learned to embrace both the good and the painful parts of his journey. "Hey, Marie," George said as he slid into the booth across from me. "It's been too long." I smiled. "It really has. So, how's everything going? You look different." He grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Yeah, I feel different. It's been a journey, but I'm finally in a place where I'm comfortable with who I am again. And, well, I'm ready to share my life with someone." I could feel the warmth in his words. He wasn't just talking about Emily. He was talking about himself, his growth, his healing, and his readiness to love again. And this time, it was on his terms, without the shadows of doubt or betrayal hanging over him. "That's great to hear, George," I said, genuinely happy for him. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of you." He smiled softly, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Marie. You were there when I needed someone. You helped me see that I could move forward. I'm not completely healed, and I know there's still work to do, but I feel like I'm finally in control of my life again." As we talked, I realized that this moment wasn't just about him finding happiness with someone new. It was about George finding himself again in the truest sense. He had spent so much time being defined by his relationship with Sarah, by the pain of betrayal. But now he was defining himself on his own terms. And in doing so, he had opened up to the possibility of love, not just with Emily, but with himself. A few months later, George and Emily took another trip together, this time to the coast. The two of them had begun to dream of a future together, building a life where they both felt whole and at peace. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would be perfect. But George had learned that life wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the courage to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey of healing, love, and rediscovery. George's story is a reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, there's always a way forward. Sometimes the hardest part is simply taking the first step. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. And as always, thank you for being here. Take care, and see you next time.